Hey, so how's it going? My name is Martin and I'm back today to talk a little bit about shooting headshots for photographers. The question being, what is the best aperture and shutter speed setting for headshots? So let's start off by talking about shutter speed. In general, you can shoot with really fast shutter speeds if you want, especially if you're out in a sunny day. But the downside to that is that there's sync problems that will come up when you're working with flash. Now, the obvious downside to shooting with a really slow shutter speed is just the fact that it's harder to hold the camera steady unless you're using a tripod. And my feeling, based on the way that I shoot and walking around a lot and everything, is that a tripod just kind of gets in the way and makes the process a little bit more cumbersome. So, in terms of shutter speed, I generally recommend that you stay between 1/160th of a second and 1/250th of a second. The reason for this, again, when you're outside, if it's a really sunny day, sometimes that shutter speed can be a little bit too slow, especially if you're shooting in direct sunlight, because your aperture, you might want to close down the aperture, but then what happens is that the background is going to go more in focus. If you're shooting slower than that, you're going to have the camera shake, as we've discussed before. If you're shooting within that range, it tends to work really well if you're going to use flash. And the way that we like to light our headshots is by taking a little tiny, actually right here, taking one of these, a speed light, and we put a softbox on the front that folds open, and we have a pocket wizard. And basically the whole setup works really, really well. You can bring it outside, it's battery powered, and you can just get really nice lighting in your pictures. If you're shooting with too fast of a shutter speed, this flash won't sync, so you won't see it in the shot. And I mean, if you're not going to use flash, then it doesn't really matter. You can shoot with as fast of a shutter speed as you want, and in my opinion, it's going to look fine. Okay, so let's talk about the aperture now. If you're going to shoot an indoor headshot against a flat background, if you're using a white background, you should definitely shoot with at least an f4, maybe an f5.6, because it's going to vignette less. So the wider open the aperture, the more the edges of the camera tend to look dark, which means if you're shooting on a flat white background, it's not going to look flat white. It's going to kind of look white behind the person, but then towards the edges, it's going to go to this gray tone. If you're going to shoot a light gray or a dark gray type of background, or like a black background, the vignetting won't matter as much. Sometimes it can actually look preferable and look really nice. So in those cases, if you're able to, I recommend shooting at the largest aperture that your lens will allow. If you're shooting with like an f1.8 or an f1.4, those can look really, really nice. However, I do recommend cautioning yourself against having an image that has such a shallow depth of field that the eye is in focus and then the rest of the face goes like so blurry that it just looks weird. Okay, it looks like their ears and the rest of their face is swimming in a pool of blur except for their eyes, which are sharp. That can look cool if you're going for a really stylized photo, but if you're, if you want to have like a real headshot and you want the face to look sharp, generally it's best to shoot at like f2, maybe f2.8 if you're going to use like a long lens, like a 200mm f2.8, that can look really nice. But if you're going to do something shorter than that, in order to blur out the background enough, if you're shooting outside, it might be necessary to shoot at a 1.4 or 1.8 aperture. Just be careful and make sure that both eyes as much as possible are in focus. If you really do have to do that stylized look where the rest of the face is kind of blurred out, whichever eye is closest to the camera should be the one in focus. So, as a very quick recap, shutter speed, keep it between 1/160th of a second and 1/250th of a second. I'll say I just pretty much always shoot at 1/200th of a second. And aperture, I pretty much shoot as wide as possible as long as I'm able to keep it sharp and focused and it's not vignetting around the edges like on a white background. Okay? Hopefully this video was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Otherwise, definitely subscribe, and as always, live with purpose.